They had everything. Predator drones circling at 18,000 feet, their infrared sensors sweeping the valleys below. Signals intercepted by Task Force Orange, filtered through servers thousands of miles away, reduced to patterns and probabilities. Rangers from the 75th Regiment holding outer cordons. Delta Force operators from 1st SFODD waiting in blackout conditions, fingers resting along the frames of suppressed 416 Hong Kong dollars carbines. And still, the compound was empty. The breach lasted 43 seconds. A shaped charge blew the wooden gate inward. 2 assault teams flowed through separate entry points, moving room to room with rehearsed precision. Night vision turned darkness into green geometry. Corners cleared. Stairwells dominated. A man ran. He was dropped before he reached the courtyard wall. Not the target. The temperature inside the mud structure was still warm. A kettle sat over a dying flame. Someone had been there less than 10 minutes earlier. They had been watching for 6 days. A Predator feed confirmed movement. A courier arrived at 2:14. A second individual entered at 3:02. No exits observed. No thermal signatures leaving the structure. At 3:47, JSOC authorized the strike package. Approval came down a compressed chain. From the forward command element at Bagram, through the JSOC operations cell, cleared understanding capture/kill authority. No delay. No debate. It was clean. It was controlled. It was wrong. Outside, the village remained still. No alarms. No fleeing civilians. No secondary movement across the irrigation routes. Just silence and the low mechanical hum of a drone that had already started to drift off target. They searched again. Floorboards lifted. Walls tapped for hollow spaces. One operator checked the roofline, scanning for heat bleed through the packed earth. Nothing. The man they were hunting had been tracked for 3 months across Nangarhar Province. His network mapped through intercepted calls, his couriers identified, his patterns analyzed down to movement windows measured in minutes. Every variable accounted for. Except the one that mattered. He was never where the system said he was. By sunrise, the helicopters were gone. 2 MH-47 Chinooks lifted the assault force out, rotors cutting through thin mountain air, banking south, toward Jalalabad. Dust settled back over the compound. From above, it looked untouched. From inside, it was empty. Again, they would review the footage, rerun the signals, rebuild the pattern. They would come back. Because the system was certain of one thing. The man was there. He just kept disappearing. They didn't lack access. They lacked confirmation. That distinction would repeat itself, quietly, across operation after operation. 3 nights later, another signal. This time it came through a different channel. Not voice. Not even direct communication. A burst of metadata flagged by Task Force Orange's signals exploitation team. An anomaly in handset behavior tied to a known courier operating between the Spingar foothills and the outskirts of Jalalabad. The handset had been dormant for 11 days. Then, for exactly 37 seconds, it connected. No conversation. Just a handshake with a tower node already under surveillance. It was enough. Inside the JSOC fusion cell at Bagram Airfield, the analysts rebuilt the picture in under 20 minutes. The courier had re-entered the network. Movement probability models shifted. A new cluster of compounds emerged within a 2.3-kilometer radius. They pushed it upward. The request moved through the system fast. It always did when the pattern matched expectation. The target was classified as a high-value individual, facilitator, financier, intermediary between local insurgent cells and external command structures. Not a fighter. Something more durable. Authorization came down again. This time, they adjusted. No static surveillance window. No extended pattern of life observation. The previous delay had been identified as the failure point. The target had slipped during that gap between certainty and action, so they compressed the timeline. 2 MQ-1 Predators took over aerial coverage, overlapping orbits to eliminate blind angles. A signals team maintained real-time monitoring of the courier's device, waiting for a second activation. On the ground, a troop from Delta Force staged out of a forward operating base near Jalalabad. 8 operators, 2 interpreters, 1 joint terminal attack controller attached for contingency air support. Insertion was scheduled for 1:20. Temperature, 4 degrees Celsius. Wind, negligible. Moonlight, low, partial cover from high cloud. The Chinook came in fast and low, terrain masking along the ridgelines to avoid acoustic detection. It touched down 1.8 kilometers from the objective, rotors never fully spooling down. The team disembarked in under 12 seconds and moved immediately to foot infiltration. No lights, no unnecessary comms. They approached along irrigation ditches, using the terrain to break silhouette. Movement was deliberate, controlled. Each man knew the spacing, each angle covered. By 1:47, they were in position. The compound matched the model. Outer wall, single entry gate, adjacent animal enclosure. Heat signatures inside. 3, possibly 4 individuals. The courier's device activated again. Confirmed inside. JSOC command authorized immediate action. No delay this time. The breach was simultaneous. Explosive entry on the main gate. Secondary team over the wall using ladder insertion. Flashbangs deployed into the central room. Controlled aggression. Speed over stealth. It lasted less than a minute. 3 men detained. 1 dead. None of them were the target. Again, the courier was there. The network was active. The signals were accurate. But the man they were building the entire operation around wasn't. Interrogations began within the hour. The detainees were moved to a temporary holding site. Tactical questioning initiated by intelligence officers embedded with the unit. Names were extracted. Routes discussed. Timelines reconstructed. Nothing held. Every answer led backward, never forward. By morning, the operation was logged as another near success. Close proximity. Confirmed network presence. Positive action against associated individuals. But the objective remained unmet. And the system adjusted again. More assets were allocated. Additional ISR coverage layered over the region. A second signals team brought into cross-reference communications. Human intelligence requests pushed through local Afghan partner units, though reliability was already being questioned. The area became saturated. More eyes, more data, more certainty, and still the same outcome. Over the next 6 weeks, the pattern repeated. A signal, a movement, a confirmation, then absence. Delta operators began to notice it first. Not in the data, in the timing. Targets were always fresh, recently vacated. Heat still present, food still warm, doors unsecured, as if departure had been unplanned, but perfectly timed. Too perfect. One operator, a troop sergeant with multiple rotations in Iraq and Afghanistan, noted it during a debrief. "They're not running from us," he said quietly. No one responded, because the system didn't recognize that as a variable. From the perspective of the intelligence architecture, everything was working. Signals were being captured. Patterns were being built. Targets were being located. The operations were precise. The units were performing. The chain of command remained intact. Requests flowed upward. Approvals came down. Execution followed. There was no visible failure point. Only an outcome that refused to align. They increased the tempo. More rates. Shorter cycles between detection and action. Less time for the target to move. It should have worked. Instead, it made the pattern tighter. More predictable. By the 8th operation, something else changed. The villagers stopped reacting. No warning fires. No fleeing silhouettes across the fields. No sudden absence of civilians before insertion. It was as if the operations had become expected. Routine. And somewhere inside that routine, the target continued to disappear. Not randomly. Not occasionally. Every time. They had drones overhead. They had signals intelligence feeding in real time. They had the most experienced direct action unit in the U.S. military executing surgical raids under near-perfect conditions. And they were chasing a man who never seemed to be where reality said he should be. They adjusted again. They always did. Because the system believed the answer was more precision, more speed, more control. It never considered that the problem wasn't how they were acting. It was how they were seeing. The system believed it was hunting a man. It wasn't. It was hunting a pattern it had created for him. That distinction never appeared in the reports. Inside the JSOC fusion cell, the target existed as a structured profile. A digital construct assembled from intercepted communications, courier movements, and geospatial correlations. Every interaction reduced to a node. Every node connected into a network. And at the center of that network, a single individual, consistent, predictable, trackable. On screens, he looked stable. In reality, he was fluid. Task Force Orange continued to feed the machine. Signals intelligence was clean. Too clean. Handsets activated within expected windows. Couriers moved along repeatable routes. Contact chains aligned with previous behavior models. Nothing contradicted the system. That was the first problem. The second was subtler. Every successful intercept reinforced the same assumption, that the network behaved like a system that could be mapped. It couldn't, because the network wasn't designed for efficiency. It was designed for survival. The couriers didn't move information the fastest way. They moved it the safest way. Indirect routes, redundant paths, intentional delays, messages broken into fragments, carried by different individuals who never met each other. Task Force Orange saw the fragments. They assembled them into something coherent. But coherence was the illusion. The man at the center of it all didn't rely on a single chain of communication. He used multiple, overlapping human networks, some that never touched signals at all. No phones, no radios, just physical movement across terrain that drones couldn't interpret as intent. A man walking along a ridge at dusk was just a man walking. Unless you understood why he chose that ridge. Unless you knew who he was avoiding. Unless you knew who he had already spoken to. The system didn't know that. It saw activity. It didn't understand meaning. So it built meaning out of repetition. And repetition became prediction. By the ninth operation, the pattern was undeniable. Every time a courier device activated, a raid followed within hours. Every time a raid followed, the target was gone within minutes before arrival. Not hours. Minutes. That gap was too small to explain through coincidence. Too consistent to ignore. But the explanation they reached was still wrong. They believed the target had early warning. They believed there was a leak. Attention shifted inward. Operational security reviews began. Communication logs were audited. Access to targeting data was tightened. Briefings were restricted to smaller circles. Even within Delta, compartmentalization increased. Assault teams received final coordinates later in the cycle, reducing exposure. They were looking for betrayal. They never found it. Because it wasn't there. The system was secure. The flaw was structural. Every operation followed the same sequence. Signal detected. Pattern confirmed. Target fixed. Authorization requested. Approval granted. Insertion executed. That sequence took time. Even at its fastest, it required coordination across multiple layers. Analysts, commanders, aviation units, ground teams. Information had to move up before action could come down. Minutes accumulated. And those minutes were visible. Not through classified channels. Through behavior. The insurgent network didn't need access to U.S. communications. It only needed to observe outcomes. A drone appearing overhead. A pattern of surveillance tightening around a compound. Local informants suddenly going quiet. Subtle changes in the environment that meant nothing to a satellite, but everything to someone living inside it. The presence of observation was the signal. And once that signal appeared, the response was immediate. The target didn't wait for confirmation. He moved at the first indication. Not when the raid started. Not when the helicopters launched. When the system began to look. That was the gap. Not technological. Cognitive. The U.S. forces believed they were operating faster than the enemy could react. In reality, they were operating slower than the enemy needed them to. Because the enemy wasn't reacting to action. He was reacting to attention. That realization didn't come from the data. It came from absence. From rooms that were always warm but never occupied. From patterns that aligned perfectly until the final moment. From a man who seemed predictable in every way except the one that mattered. He was never there. Not because he couldn't be found, but because he understood exactly how they were trying to find him. And more importantly, when. The first change didn't come from JSOC. It came from men who had learned to operate without being seen long before drones defined the sky. The British had been in Helmand for years before the surveillance architecture reached its peak density. Not with saturation. Not with persistent ISR. They didn't have that luxury. What they had was time. And memory. Elements of the Special Air Service had built something slower, less visible. Their patrols from D Squadron didn't rely on constant overhead coverage. They moved in four-man teams, sometimes six, inserted at night by RAF Chinooks, or, when conditions demanded it, by ground infiltration that took days instead of minutes. They stayed. Not for hours. For weeks. They learned the terrain the way locals understood it. Not as coordinates. As behavior. Which paths were used at dusk. Which compounds had fires at unusual hours. Which men walked alone, and which ones never did. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. When liaison officers from Task Force Black began sharing observations with JSOC elements operating further east, the contrast was immediate. Not in capability. In approach. The Americans were compressing time. The SAS had expanded it. Where JSOC relied on signals to define the network, the SAS treated signals as noise, useful, but never decisive. They built human networks instead. Slow, fragile, often unreliable. But when they worked, they didn't describe patterns. They revealed intent. One report, passed quietly through joint channels, described a target who never used the same courier. Twice. No electronic signature. No repeatable pattern. Yet he could still be located, because he always avoided the same village after making contact. Avoidance became the signature. It was the inverse of what Task Force Orange was tracking, and it forced a question the system hadn't asked. What if the absence of behavior was more important than the presence of it? That idea didn't fit cleanly into the existing model, but it lingered. Inside a small JSOC planning element, a shift began. Not official, not doctrinal, conceptual. They stopped asking where the target was. They started asking where he refused to be. It required stripping the model down, removing layers of assumed certainty, ignoring high-confidence signals that had repeatedly led to empty rooms. The first constraint they introduced was counterintuitive. No immediate action. When a signal appeared, they would not strike. They would watch. Not with drones alone. With distance. With restraint. Predator feeds remained overhead, but at higher altitude, reducing acoustic signature. Observation windows extended beyond the moment of confirmation. Instead of compressing the timeline, they stretched it, allowing behavior to unfold beyond the system's previous cutoff point. It was uncomfortable. Every instinct inside the command structure pushed against it. Confirmation demanded action. Delay felt like failure. But they held it. The second adjustment was more difficult. They reduced visibility. No layered ISR saturation. No overlapping drone orbits that turned the sky into a constant presence. Fewer assets. Narrower focus. Observation conducted in a way that didn't announce itself. This wasn't about capability. It was about perception. If the target moved at the first sign of attention, then attention itself had to disappear. That meant accepting blindness. Intentionally. On the ground, the change was even more pronounced. Instead of staging large, rapid assault elements, they deployed smaller reconnaissance teams. Delta Force operators working in reduced signatures, inserted further away, sometimes over 5 kilometers from the objective area. No immediate target package. No confirmed compound. Just terrain. They moved at night. Hid during the day. Established observation points overlooking routes rather than structures. Watching movement, not locations. It resembled something closer to long-range reconnaissance than direct action. For some within JSOC, it felt like regression. Less control. Less certainty. But the SAS officers understood it immediately. They had been doing it for years. Because the objective was never just to find a man. It was to understand how he survived. The final shift came in how they interpreted time. Previously, the system measured success in minutes. Time from detection to action. Time from insertion to clearance. Time from breach to extraction. Now, they measured it in gaps. The delay between a signal and a reaction. The silence after a known courier disappeared. The absence of movement where movement should have occurred. Time became a negative space. And inside that space, patterns began to emerge that the system had never seen before. Not because they were hidden, but because no one had been looking long enough to notice them. The doctrine didn't change overnight. It never does. But something inside the system had shifted. Not in what it could do, in what it chose to ignore. They chose not to strike. That was the first decision that felt like failure. At 2:11, the signal appeared again. The same courier handset. Same brief activation window. 30 seconds, then silence. Task Force Orange flagged it immediately, pushing coordinates into the JSOC operations cell. The pattern was familiar. Too familiar. 6 weeks earlier, this would have triggered immediate action. Delta Force would already be loading onto MH-47s. The assault timeline compressed to under an hour. Everything aligned toward speed. This time, nothing moved. The drone remained at altitude. Orbit widened to reduce acoustic footprint. No second asset layered in. No visible escalation. On the ground, 5 Delta operators from B Squadron were already in place. They had been there for 36 hours. No vehicles. No external support. Inserted 2 nights earlier by a single Chinook that never came closer than 4 kilometers to the drop point. From there, they moved on foot through terraced farmland and dry irrigation channels, establishing a concealed observation post along a ridgeline overlooking a narrow valley. Elevation, 1,240 meters. Temperature at night, dropping to 2 degrees Celsius. Wind, intermittent, shifting downslope after midnight. They had line of sight over 3 compounds. None of them had been previously identified as high-value locations. That was intentional. The courier's signal mapped closest to the central compound, but they didn't move toward it. They watched the routes instead. Footpaths connecting structures. Narrow trails cutting across. The lower ridge. A dry riverbed that acted as a natural corridor between villages. Movement mattered more than position now. At 2:26, the first figure appeared. Single male. Moving without light. No visible weapon. He crossed the lower path at a steady pace. Not hurried. Not cautious. The operators didn't react. 15 minutes later, a second figure emerged from a different direction. Slower. Paused twice along the route, as if listening. He never approached the central compound. Instead, he diverted along the ridge and disappeared behind a cluster of trees. Still no reaction. Inside the JSOC command cell, the delay was being tracked. Every instinct inside the system was pushing for action. The signal had been confirmed. Movement was present. The pattern was forming. But they held. Because this time, they weren't trying to intercept the pattern. They were trying to see what happened after it. At 3:03, the third movement occurred. This one was different. 2 individuals, moving together. One slightly ahead, the second maintaining distance. They approached the central compound, paused at the outer wall, then entered without hesitation. No visible security. No overwatch. No attempt to conceal entry. That alone was unusual. The operators adjusted optics. Thermal overlays confirmed at least 4 heat signatures inside. And then, nothing. No exits. No additional movement. The pattern had stabilized. This was the moment the system used to act. Inside the command chain, the request began to form. It moved upward automatically. Target presence, multi-source confirmation, opportunity window. But this time it stopped. Held at the operational level. Denied by absence of understanding. On the ridgeline, the Delta team remained still. Time extended. 10 minutes. 20. 40. At 3:47, something changed. Not at the compound. Along the ridge, a fourth individual appeared, moving fast. Not toward the compound. Away from it. He emerged from behind the same tree cluster where the second figure had disappeared earlier. His pace was controlled but urgent, maintaining low profile, using terrain to mask movement. The operators tracked him immediately. This was different. He wasn't part of the visible pattern. He was outside it. The team leader made a decision. Not to engage. To follow. 2 operators broke from the observation post, moving parallel to the individual's route, maintaining distance of approximately 80 meters. No direct line of sight. Just intermittent visual. Confirmation through terrain breaks and thermal signatures. The man moved with familiarity. He avoided open ground. Used elevation changes to break silhouette. Never stopped. This wasn't random movement. This was practiced. The pursuit lasted 27 minutes. Distance covered, just over 1.6 kilometers. The terrain shifted as they moved, terraced fields giving way to rockier incline, then flattening into a narrow basin partially shielded from aerial view by overlapping ridgelines. The drone feed lost clarity here. Not completely, just enough. The man descended into the basin and approached a structure that hadn't appeared in any previous model. No signal history, no known association, no recorded activity, which is why it had never been targeted. He entered without hesitation. The Delta operators halted at the edge of the basin. Observation only. They adjusted optics, scanning the structure. Thermal confirmed 1 additional heat signature inside before his arrival. Then 2. No movement for several minutes. Back on the ridgeline. The remaining operators continued to monitor the original compound. At 4:12, the first exit occurred. 1 individual left. Not the same as those who entered. Different build. Different movement pattern. He moved casually, walking along the lower path as if nothing had changed. Then another. And another. By 4:25, the compound was empty. The pattern had dissolved. But now, for the first time, they had something else. Separation. The system had been watching the center. The target had never stayed there. He used it as a transfer point. A place to be seen, not a place to remain. In the basin, the Delta team maintained position. No immediate action. They watched for 52 minutes. At 5:04, just before first light began to touch the upper ridge lines, the door opened. 1 man stepped out. Alone. No escort. No visible security. He paused briefly, scanning the horizon, not with urgency, but with habit. Then he moved toward a narrow path leading further south, deeper into terrain that drones struggled to interpret. The team leader didn't need confirmation. He didn't request it. He spoke once, low, controlled. Target confirmed. Back at command, the request finally moved. But this time, it wasn't built on prediction. It was built on observation. And for the first time in weeks, they weren't late. The decision reached them before the sun did. No debate. No extended approval cycle climbing through layers of command. The authority sat forward this time. Inside the JSOC operations cell, the ground force commander held it. Because this was no longer a projection. This was presence. At 5:06, the order was given. Not a full assault. A containment. The difference was precise. 2 MH-47 Chinooks lifted from Jalalabad within 4 minutes. Rotors cutting through cold morning air, carrying a reinforced element from Delta Force, 6 additional operators, a sniper pair, and a forward JTAC. No heavy footprint. No visible escalation. Flight path stayed low, terrain masking along the southern ridgelines. No direct approach to the basin. They would land offset, 2.7 kilometers south, forcing a ground movement that preserved the illusion of absence. On the ground, the tracking element never broke contact. The target had already moved. By 5:11, he was 300 meters beyond the basin, following a narrow goat trail that angled along the slope. The terrain worked in his favor. Broken rock, scattered vegetation, elevation shifts that fractured visibility every few seconds. But he wasn't moving fast. He wasn't running. That was the final confirmation. A man who believes he is being hunted accelerates. A man who believes he is unseen maintains rhythm. The Delta operators adjusted spacing, widening their shadow to 120 meters. No direct line. Only intermittent thermal confirmation and terrain-based prediction. They didn't chase him. They flowed with him. At 5:19, the Chinooks touched down. Insertion was clean. No visual signature carried beyond the immediate landing zone. The reinforcing element moved immediately, splitting into 2 maneuver units. One to cut off the southern exit routes. The other to move north, closing distance toward the tracking team. The net was forming, but slowly, deliberately. No sudden compression. No signal to trigger flight. Inside the command chain, communication remained minimal. The ground force commander retained control. Requests didn't move upward. They didn't need to. This was no longer a question of permission. It was a question of timing. At 5:28, the target adjusted course. Slight deviation. 5 degrees west. Subtle, but enough. The lead tracker noticed it first. A change in intent, not direction. The path ahead led toward a small cluster of structures. Unmapped, partially concealed by terrain folds. If he reached them, the pattern would reset. More bodies. More noise. More exits. More disappearance. The team leader made the call. Interception. Not at the structure. Before it. 2 operators. Accelerated, cutting diagonally across the slope to establish a forward blocking position. Distance, 210 meters, and closing. Movement remained low, controlled, using terrain to mask approach. No verbal communication. Only hand signals. Timing was everything now. At 5:34, the target crossed a shallow depression, terrain that briefly exposed his silhouette against the rising light. For 3 seconds, he was visible. Clear. Unobstructed. The forward element was already in position. One operator, prone behind a low rock formation, adjusted his sight picture. 416 Hong Kong dollars braced, suppressed, reticle steady. He didn't fire. Because that wasn't the objective. Capture was still the directive. The second operator moved. Fast. Closing the final 30 meters with controlled aggression, angling to intercept rather than pursue. The terrain masked his approach until the last moment. At 5:35, the distance collapsed. The target saw him. Too late. He pivoted, instinctively moving to break line of sight, but the second operator had already shifted, cutting off the angle. A third operator emerged from the flank, completing the containment. 3 points. No escape. The target froze. Not in panic. In calculation. His eyes moved once. Left, right, distance, terrain, options. There were none. The team leader stepped forward, weapon low but ready. Commands issued in controlled Pashto through the attached interpreter. Clear. Direct. No escalation. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the man lowered his shoulders. Not surrender. Acceptance. At 5:36, the objective was secured. No shots fired. No alarms raised. No movement from the nearby structures. The system had finally aligned with reality. Extraction began immediately. The target was moved south, away from the structures he had been approaching. Hands restrained, eyes covered. Standard procedure. No deviation. The Chinooks returned at 5:49. Same approach. Same discipline. No lingering presence. By 5:52, they were airborne. The basin, the ridge lines, the empty compound miles behind them, all of it returned to stillness. From above, nothing had changed. No evidence of contact. No visible disruption. Just terrain. And silence. Inside the aircraft, no one spoke. They didn't need to. Because the difference was already understood. Every operation before this had been faster. More precise. More controlled. And all of them had failed. This one had done less. Seen more. And for the first time, arrived before the absence. They would call it a success. Inside the after-action report, it would read clean. Target captured. No casualties. No compromise of surrounding population. Timeline efficient. Execution disciplined. Everything the system was designed to produce. But that wasn't what mattered. Because nothing in that report explained why the previous 11 operations had failed. And nothing in that language captured what had actually changed. The man they had been hunting for 3 months didn't disappear because he was invisible. He disappeared because he understood the rhythm of the force hunting him. He knew how long it took between detection and action. He knew what attention felt like before it became pressure. He didn't wait for helicopters. He moved when the system began to look. That was the advantage. Not firepower. Not numbers. Timing. For weeks, JSOC had been operating inside its own tempo. Detection triggered action. Action defined success. Every layer optimized for speed, for compression, for control. But speed created a pattern. And patterns could be read. The insurgent network didn't need to break encryption. It didn't need access to classified systems. It only needed to observe the consequences. A drone overhead that lingered too long. A village that suddenly fell silent. A courier who changed behavior after contact. These were signals, not electronic, human, and they were enough. The system had been solving the wrong problem. It believed the challenge was locating the target. So it built better ways to find him. More sensors, more data, more precision. But the target was never hiding from detection. He was avoiding the moment that came after it. The problem was not visibility. It was predictability. And predictability, once established, becomes vulnerability. The shift that led to his capture wasn't technological. It was cognitive. They didn't add capability. They removed assumption. They stopped reacting to confirmation. They stopped compressing time. They stopped announcing their presence through the very systems designed to give them advantage. Instead, they watched. They allowed the pattern to extend beyond the moment where they used to act. They accepted uncertainty. They accepted delay. And in doing so, they stepped outside the rhythm the target had learned to exploit. That was the difference. The SAS had understood it long before. Not as doctrine written in manuals, but as behavior learned through repetition. They operated without urgency because urgency revealed intent. They built human networks because human behavior carried meaning that signals could not. They stayed in place long enough to see what didn't happen. Absence, avoidance, silence. These were not gaps in intelligence. They were intelligence. JSOC didn't become the SAS. It didn't abandon its systems. It adjusted how it used them. Signals became indicators, not answers. Drones became tools for confirmation, not triggers for action. Delta operators became observers before they were assaulters. And command shifted forward, closer to the ground, where decisions could be made without the delay that defined the system's previous failures. The result wasn't just one successful operation. It was a change in how the problem was understood. Irregular warfare doesn't reward the strongest force. It exposes the most predictable one. Power creates presence. Presence creates patterns. And patterns, once seen, can be avoided. The insurgent never needed to defeat the system. He only needed to stay outside its timing. For weeks, he had done exactly that. Until the system stopped behaving like a system and started behaving like a human. That was when the gap closed. Not through force, not through speed, but through understanding. They didn't win because they found him. They won because, for the first time, they stopped showing him how.